Hello everyone, this is Dr. Marta Werner, and I am here to talk to you a little bit about your blog posts on the Old Testament and to prepare us for your next readings in Homer's Odyssey. My video today will be perhaps a little sterner than usual, and I'm hoping it's the only time I'll have to be a little bit stern. I enjoyed your posts on the Old Testament, but they were not quite what I was looking for in most cases. I was relatively generous because it's early in the term, and I want to make absolutely sure that I'm clear about my expectations. In the last video, in which I gave you a few instructions about responding to the Old Testament, I did give you some very precise directions concerning your approach to the reading. And one of the things I asked you to consider was that we were going to be looking at the Old Testament as a piece of literature, which of course it is. And I also mentioned that this had nothing to do with my own personal relationship to faith or my own respect for your various faiths, whatever they might be. But because this is a class on literature, we need to look necessarily at texts from the perspective of literature. What I got, for the most part, were were responses that either talk to me about your faith, talk to me about the messages, the kind of moral messages of the texts, which were, for the most part, rather conventional Sunday school type messages, or in some cases questions about the texts, which were moving in the right direction, but which had very little behind them in terms of background materials. I had hoped that here are some of the things that I'd hope you would talk about. Maybe this is the best way to kind of show you the direction I was hoping for. For one thing, I was hoping that you would address the origins of the book of Genesis. This is a text with an extremely long history, a complicated history, a complicated textual history. And it's a textual history that I outlined in some detail in the lecture notes, as well as at least a little bit in sort of the key points that always some of the key points on the text that I also shared with you. I also hope that you might say a little bit, perhaps in some cases, about the materials that make up the primal history, the different kinds of materials that make up that history. I thought that you might address the importance of the word, or language, in the creation of the world. This would be, it seems to me, a very fertile way of beginning, since we're talking about literature, we're talking about a text, and we're talking about a text that, a word, the power of language, that at least on a figurative level brings the entire creation into being. I thought that you might talk about the structure of the particular texts that we were reading. So, for example, in the case of Genesis 1, the case of the creation of the world, that you might think about the meaning of those separations, the separation of space and time, the various separations that structure that text, and what they mean, what they mean both practically, but also in some senses metaphorically, imaginatively. What are some of the midrashic interpretations of that meaning of separation? I had also hoped that perhaps if you were talking about Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation of the creation stories, that you might think about the relationship between those two texts, right, and think about how the relationship, the temporal relationship of those texts, is different than the textual relationship of those texts. Very important, right? And also what's different about those two stories, and why might those differences be significant? I also thought that perhaps if you were going to deal with the fall, that you would think not only about the immediate consequences of Adam and Eve's transgression, right, but also of the ultimate consequences of that transgression, and what it means, right, figuratively, to be expelled from the Garden of Eden. Right? What does it mean to fall into a world of time and a world ultimately of death? What does it mean to fall into a slant as opposed to a direct relationship with one's creator? I was a little bit disappointed in your responses to the serpent, right? Because if we look carefully at that text, not at what our Sunday school teachers may or may not have told us, but if we look carefully at the text, right, the serpent is dealt with very, very differently than Adam and Eve, right, particularly in the course of the trial. And the serpent is dealt with differently, I think, right, because the serpent is not really responsible. Right? The serpent is not really Satan. He's not clearly so. The serpent is, in many ways, just a kind of embodiment, right, physical embodiment of the experience of temptation that is in all of us. I had hoped that if you were going to look at the story of Cain and Abel, that you would begin to trace some of the structural similarities between that story and the story of the fall, right? Particularly structural similarities concerning the trials. I'd also hoped that if you dealt with Cain and Abel, that some of you might mention the poem that I gave you by Dan Pages, an extraordinary poem, 20th century poem, written in the wake of the Holocaust, concerning the figure of Cain. I'd like you, if you haven't looked at that, I'd like you to go back to look at it, because it's an extraordinary poem, and it's a poem that raises questions about who Cain is to not only to us, right, but particularly to Eve. In terms of the flood story, this might have been the most extraordinary place where I was simply amazed at how the conventional wisdom overtook you in your analyses of the story. A close reading of the flood cannot help but reveal the absolutely catastrophic, cataclysmic nature of this event. Right? The scope, the scale is unimaginable, frankly unimaginable. And responses that focus on Noah as a good man, right? Where's the evidence, first of all, that Noah is a good and just man? But responses that simply take that level of destruction for granted without thinking about how the writer of that text is expressing the horror, right? The horror of this event, and without thinking perhaps about the nature of that event. Was it in fact, could it in fact be the case that every living thing on this planet should be destroyed? Try to conceptualize that, and then try to think about how, in some senses, questionable a reading of Noah as the only good person might be. Right? So instead of focusing on the moral, right, about how it is we have to be good and just and we'll be saved, right, think about the language of that text and the horror that is conveyed in that text. If you don't want to approach it that way, right, if that is upsetting to you in some ways, you might want at least to think about how you might might approach the arc, what could that be, right? What is that space? What is happening in that space? And also what is not happening in that space? There's a very, very beautiful midrashic reading of this text that I gave you some notes about in my lectures that concern the ark as the laboratory of kindness, a place where instead of the kinds of breeding, right, and production of things, right? We have a moment sort of taken out of time when all of the attention is given to the caring of things, of caring about things, right? The caring of things, the literal keeping alive of all of the inhabitants on the ark, and how different that condition is to the condition of the world that has just been destroyed. So think about how a midrashic scholar might approach the story of the flood. I'm giving you many tools on Moodle that I know probably you won't have the opportunity or frankly the time to use all of them, but I want to emphasize how important it is to use some of them. And I know that this is perhaps foreign to some of you who have taken perhaps even other courses online where the work is distributed a little bit differently. But in this course, I give you access to all of my lectures, discussion questions, forums for open forums for questions. And these are things that you really need to be, you are responsible for, right? As if we were meeting 2 or 3 times a week in a classroom where I would give those lectures. Right? It's important to try to absorb as much of that material as possible and to find ways, right, of integrating those materials into your responses. Since this is a literature course, and primarily a literature course as opposed to a writing intensive course, I'm looking for your ideas. Right? I'm not really grading you on the quality of your writing. I might mention it to you, but really what I'm looking for here is the quality of your ideas. How well do you read? How much are you analyzing? How much material are you integrating, right? Lecture materials are you integrating into your own understanding of things? These are very, very important things. The most important thing you can do is to leave the class with more knowledge of something than you came into it with. And even with literature, right? This is something, literature opens itself up to you. The more experience you have, the more knowledge of history, the more knowledge of a history of criticism that you have. It's my responsibility to give that to you, and I try to do that. And it's your responsibility to take some of that, take what is most compelling in those materials, and integrate them into your own system of thinking, and write about them. And so as we move into our next reading on the Odyssey, I want to see more of that happen. Over the next week, you'll be reading books 1 through 8 of Homer's Odyssey. And in addition to reading those books, I want you to try to look at the lecture materials. There's a lot of material, particularly on the Odyssey, and I don't expect you to be able to recall it all, right? And that's not the point, right? But the point is to understand something, right, about the Odyssey from your reading, and then to deepen your understanding of that text through an understanding, through a real close perusal of the lecture materials. So your mission, if you decide to accept it in your next blog, is to give me a sense that's happening, right? That this course is progressing, right? That you're progressing, that we're progressing together in our understanding. I take your work very seriously when I read it. I think that, at least I try to convey that through the density of the commenting I do on your work. I would like you to give the same respect to the work that I give to you each week. It's not work that I'm copying from Wikipedia. It's work that gets done over a long, long period of time. And work that I want to share with you, right? That is my greatest delight as a professor of English is to share that work. And my other greatest delight is to see you really developing in your thinking, not just mimicking what I say, but taking perhaps what I say that you didn't know and going further with it, or taking it in a different direction. That's how real scholarship gets done. And I know you can do it. And if there's any way that I can help you, please let me know. I'm always open to helping you in any way possible. All right, I'm looking forward to your blogs on the Odyssey, and have a wonderful week reading this text that perhaps many of you have read before, but that certainly bears more than one reading. All right, take care, and I'll see you next week.